Thanks everyone for being understanding about missing class these last couple of days. I was injured skiing this past weekend, and I'm hoping to be back on Friday. But in the meantime, I've again decided to do some lectures to ensure that we stay on track with the schedule. So this video is going to talk about Chapter 4, which is on ethics and corrections. I will post these slides online, so you don't necessarily have to worry about writing down all of what you see on the screen. Instead, you might want to print the slides and take notes on what I say. So, thinking about ethics and corrections, we have to differentiate between professionalism and ethics. And so, usually I do an activity in class to get you thinking about what it means to be professional or unprofessional in a job. And so professionalism, surely that you can think of a time that you may have interacted with someone at the bank or even at a fast food restaurant or something like that, where you were interacting with someone in their capacity as an employee. And in instances where you interact with someone that you feel is professional, there may be some characteristics that you recognize. So treating people with respect could be taking responsibility for if they have an error. It could be that they listen and that they are not demeaning to customers. Those are all just some examples of professional characteristics. And if you can think of a time that you had an interaction with someone that you felt was exhibiting professional behavior, you may be able to connect some of that information here. On the other hand, unprofessional behavior, you may be able to think of a time where someone was in an employee context, that they were behaving in an unprofessional way, and perhaps that could be that the individual was disrespectful or rude, that they didn't listen to the customer's needs, something like that. So usually I do an activity to surround these two topics to get you thinking about what it means to be a professional or unprofessional, but instead we're kind of moving along here without that. So, to just jump off here with the actual definition of professionalism. So the definition here is to be courteous, conscientious, and just businesslike in general. And that relates to a professional environment, a work environment. The way in which this is differentiated from ethics is that ethics is also relevant to a professional sphere, but it's about differentiating between what is right and what is wrong. And you can think of that in the sense that someone who is professional is theoretically being ethical, but even if someone is unprofessional, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not being ethical. And so there's sometimes a fine line between these two different things. And this may relate to something if you've heard of whether or not something is moral. Morality usually is more relevant to a personal sphere. So we're going to be talking about professionalism and ethics as it relates to a professional context or a professional sphere. And so ethics in the professional sphere are usually determined by, first of all, what is legal. So is there a law against this in whatever the context is? And this is usually outlined fairly clearly in a code of ethics or policies and procedures for any type of organization. And if you think about even your role as a student, there is a student code of conduct document that outlines some rules that students should follow while they're at SUNY Fredonia. And so those types of things in your student code of conduct are very relevant to defining what ethics would be as your role as a professional student, so to say. And outside of the work context, there are several institutions that try to instill ethical and even professional behavior in individuals. So that could be family members, it could be religious institutions. As I had mentioned with the Student Code of Conduct, it could also be educational institutions. It could be the actual clubs or something that someone is in. It could be the military, for example. So there's a whole host of ways in which people learn ethical behavior in the context of what we're going to be keeping with here in corrections and in the criminal justice system. Employees are learning what is ethical based on the code of conduct for different positions. And so within the criminal justice system, we have a variety of different codes that outline professional and ethical behavior for law enforcement, for judges, things like that. So these different code of ethics outlined here are associated with specific positions in the criminal justice system. So the law enforcement code of ethics, not surprisingly, outlines what behaviors constitute ethical and unethical behavior for law enforcement. So this would largely relate to police officers. The second code of ethics listed here, the model code of judicial conduct, not surprisingly, that relates to judges and their capacity. The model rules of professional conduct is relevant for lawyers, so that could be attorneys, whether it be defense or prosecution. So that's what is for lawyers. And then the other thing that I'll mention here, the American Correctional Association Code of Ethics is relevant for, not surprisingly, correctional officers. Okay? So the law enforcement is for police, the Code of Judicial Conduct is for judges, the rules of professional conduct is for lawyers, and then the American Correctional Association ethics are for correctional officers. Each of these things has specific guidelines listed that indicate what type of behavior individuals in these capacities should follow. So in deciding whether or not a behavior is considered ethical or not can fall under different philosophical foundations. And so your book covers 7 different philosophical foundations that guide ethical decision making. So we're going to focus on 2, and then with each one of those 2, there's another subset there. So the first ethical foundation that we're focusing on are deontological ethical systems. So the deontological ethical system is when an act itself, the actual act or the actual behavior, is what is defining right or wrong. So the deontological ethical systems are guiding ethical behavior by determining whether an act itself is ethical or not. So say, for example, if someone in law enforcement has to use lethal force to protect themselves, the deontological system may view that as, even though the outcome was to protect themselves for safety, a deontological system might see the act of using lethal force as wrong, just because the act in and of itself is wrong. So this deontological ethical system falls under this larger umbrella of ethical formalism. And so ethical formalism is the idea that there is no gray area for behaviors, that acts and behaviors are either right or wrong. So they're either good or bad. it doesn't matter what the outcome is in the end, that if it's a unethical behavior, no matter what the context is, it's unethical. So that again could relate to law enforcement using lethal force, or even soldiers in war using lethal force, that these deontological and ethical formalism might say that murder is wrong no matter what the context is, no matter what the circumstances are. So ethical formalism and deontological define whether or not an act is ethical based on the actual behavior. So this photo here on the right says deontology is that the end does not justify the means. So the outcome or the context does not justify a behavior. That if it's wrong, it's wrong. So the other ethical foundation that we're going to talk about are teleological ethical systems. And so this foundation for determining whether behavior is ethical or unethical is relevant to whatever the outcome of that act or behavior was. So a teleological ethical system sees and defines behaviors as being right or wrong depending on the outcome. So in a situation, for example, again, if law enforcement has to engage and use lethal force, that if it's to ensure safety of hostages, for example, that the teleological ethical system would say that murdering a suspect would be ethical if the context is to provide someone else with safety, for example. Because under the teleological system, they care about the consequences or outcome of an act. So the teleological system relates to utilitarianism. And so this utilitarianism views ethical and unethical behavior as being defined on whether or not people are benefiting from an act. So the utilitarianism is defining whether or not a behavior is good based on the number of people that are being helped or benefited from the act. So again, this teleological system and the utilitarianism are defining ethical and unethical behavior as it relates to whether the outcome of an act is good or not. So this picture on the left, utilitarianism, states that the end justifies the means. So even if the end result is problematic, or excuse me, I should rephrase that. Even if the behavior itself is problematic, like using lethal force on the job, if the end, meaning someone's safety, for example, is beneficial to some people, that problematic behavior would be justified by the outcome. So I have a video that hopefully will give you an idea of these ethical foundations.
A runaway train is heading towards 5 workers on a railway line. There's no way of warning them, but you're standing near a lever that operates some points. Switch the points, and the train goes down a spur. Trouble is, there's another worker on that bit of track too, but it's 1 fatality instead of 5. Should you do that? Many people think the right thing to do.
Okay, so in this instance, they're suggesting that there is a runaway train that's coming towards 5 people on a track, and if you pull a lever, that the train would go down a different track, but 1 person would be killed. So you can think of this as being related to the teleological and deontological systems, because the teleological determines ethical behavior by how many people benefit from the act. So if you pull the lever and save 5 people, that the act of murdering the one person is justified because 5 people have been saved. The deontological system, however, would argue that no, it is unethical to pull the lever to choose to murder one person. It doesn't matter if the outcome would be that 5 other people are saved. The deontological is defining the act of pulling the lever itself as unethical because that act in and of itself is wrong.
It would be to switch the points, to sacrifice 1 to save 5, since that produces the best outcome possible. Now imagine the train heading for the workers again. This time it can only be stopped by pushing a very large man off a bridge. His great bulk would stop the train, but he'd die. Should you do that? Most people say no.
Okay, again, so under this circumstance, there's perhaps a more direct, measurable action. So instead of pulling a lever, you'd be pushing someone in front of the train. And so they are outlining this behavior as pushing an individual in front of the train. And they're going to talk about it as it relates to the deontological ethical foundation and the teleological ethical foundation. So the deontological would say, no, it is not right to push someone in front of the train. And the teleological system would say, well, it may be considered an appropriate behavior because more people in the end will benefit.
No. But why not? Both thought experiments are cases of sacrificing 1 to save 5. What the trolley problem examines is whether moral decisions are simply about outcomes or about the manner in which you achieve them. Some utilitarians argue that the 2 cases are not importantly different from each other. Both have similar consequences, and consequences are all that really matter. In each case, 1 person dies and 5 are saved, the best option in each harrowing situation. But lots of people say they would switch the points, but they wouldn't push the man off the bridge. Are they simply inconsistent, or are they onto something?
So hopefully that little video was entertaining and gave you a little bit of an application from these deontological and teleological perspectives, or the ethical formalism and utilitarianism perspectives. In the context of professional environments, anything in the criminal justice system in particular, there's many reasons why individuals may engage in unethical behavior. You know, for example, it could be that someone just wants to have a personal gain from the behavior that they're engaging in. It could be that there is some kind of pressure coming from either the company or individuals' personal lives to engage in some type of unethical behavior. It could be that an individual is just selfish and maybe perhaps they are trying to gain something from it. It could be that someone is unhappy with the compensation that they're receiving in a job. So there are all types of reasons as to why individuals may behave unethically. But we're going to focus on 3 here. So we're going to talk about official deviance, noble cause corruption, and subculture. Official deviance are acts that are considered unethical because they are violating the rules outlined in a code of conduct, for example. So official deviance are things that are violating the rules, and that's why it's considered unethical. But it's termed official deviance because the organization or other members of an organization actually benefit from the act. So under official deviance, the individual themselves maybe not gain much, but it's overall beneficial for an organization. In noble cause corruption, This would be when an individual, you could think of, say, criminal justice workers or corrections workers, something like that, are doing something that is considered unethical, but they're doing it for the purpose of serving some larger good. And the noble cause corruption is more likely to occur when employees are not supervised. It's also more likely to occur when employees have discretion in their position. And so discretion would mean that individuals have the choice to engage in some acts or not. So say, for example, law enforcement, police officers have a lot of discretion on the job because they can, for example, decide to give someone a ticket or not. They can decide to arrest someone or not, under most circumstances, that is, that there is some discretion involved. So these types of acts that fall under noble cause corruption could be, for example, if an officer wholeheartedly believes that a suspect is guilty and that the individual is the offender, if there's not enough evidence to produce probable cause, that an officer could plant evidence to ensure that this individual is then pursued as a suspect. So this noble cause corruption could be that the act itself of planting evidence is problematic. That is unethical. But in the mind of the law enforcement officer, they may see it as their behavior is doing something for the greater good, to get an offender off the streets, to ensure safety. So that's something that falls under the noble cause corruption. Subculture, the last topic that we'll talk about for justifying why people engage in unethical behavior, is when some type of subculture exists, and that could be in police, it could be in corrections, probation, parole officers, things like that. So in these subsets of cultures, so we have our larger society and then we have subsets within society, that there is some kind of culture that develops within this particular subset. So if you check your textbook, the book gives an example of probation and parole officers and the subculture that develops within probation and parole officers. And so that list, it talks about, for example, not ratting on coworkers, even if an individual knows that their coworker is doing wrong. It could be that having, I think some of the other things in the list would be is that having an us versus them mentality. So the subculture suggests that parole and probation officers should not identify with their clients, for example, that it's us versus them, that they are separate. And something else that's mentioned in that list of subcultures that define the probation and parole officers are the desire to stay cynical towards clients and to not be sympathetic. So there are a host of different behaviors and values and things that can undermine the code of ethics for various jobs because subcultures develop. So if you think about these three different things and how it relates to the deontological or teleological ethical foundations, think about that for a second. Which ones parallel the deontological and which ones parallel the teleological systems of ethical behavior? Again, the deontological, that relates to defining whether the act itself is good or not, and the teleological defines the ethical nature of an act based on the outcome of the act and if it's helping people or benefiting someone. So hopefully you thought about that and maybe connected the dots here with official deviance being a deontological system. So official deviance would be categorized as being unethical under the deontological system. So the deontological would say that even though a behavior may be benefiting an organization, that it is considered unethical because the behavior itself is violating the code of conduct, for example. This also relates to the noble cause corruption. So deontological systems would define any type of behaviors that are unethical, even though it might be for the greater good, but the deontological system is saying that it's wrong because the actual act itself was wrong. It doesn't matter in the end if it's beneficial for larger society or not. And the teleological system, this is a little bit harder to apply to the subculture, but you could see that, so the teleological system, again, defines, and utilitarianism, defines behaviors as right or wrong, depending on the outcome. And so a subculture might, in and of itself, define behaviors as appropriate because it benefits the subculture. So one of the things outlined in your text about the subculture for probation and parole officers is that individuals should not be rate busters. And rate busters are individuals in an organization who are working hard enough to outperform other employees. And the probation and parole subculture says that working hard and overachieving is problematic because it hurts the rest of the subculture. So subcultures really care about whether or not behaviors are benefiting the subculture or not. So that might be why it may relate more to a teleological system. So, unethical behaviors and corrections. What are some examples of unethical behaviors? Surely you can think of many examples of behaviors that might be considered unethical and corrections, and that could be falsification of records, indicating that perhaps someone had engaged in behavior that was considered a violation, even if the person didn't. Introduction of contraband could be individuals who work in a correctional facility and are bringing materials in that they're not supposed to, whether it be cell phones, drugs, or even less hazardous things, but just anything that's not supposed to be brought in. If it is, that would be constituted as a contraband. Overlooking violations could be another type of behavior that's unethical, although that line may be a little bit difficult to draw in the sense that, again, many fields allow employees to have discretion in their job, and so perhaps overlooking the fact that someone is speeding, it's kind of hard to determine whether or not that would be considered an unethical behavior. Although, again, this kind of depends on whether or not someone is seeing behavior and defining it from the deontological or teleological perspective. The excessive use of force, under some circumstances for sure, could be considered unethical behavior. There is a use of force continuum that corrections officers and law enforcement officers are supposed to work their way up in circumstances, and so sometimes if there's an inappropriate jump between levels of uses of force, that could be considered unethical behavior. Some other unethical behavior would be in the context of the correctional system. If corrections officers develop an intimate relationship with individuals who are incarcerated, that could be considered unethical. And then lastly, sexual harassment against other employees or even clients, so clients being inmates or probationers or parolees. So those are all kind of examples, just a few examples of behaviors that could be considered unethical. And so now I have an example video of real unethical behavior that had occurred in the state of New York, and so I will play that now.
For the first time, the prison seamstress breaking down in court right in front of the cameras. Here are the pictures tonight, wiping away tears, pleading guilty, revealing her sexual relationship, her plot with the two escaped killers, and what she was supposed to do to her husband. And remember, American taxpayers footing the bill in this case for that emergency response that terrified towns on lockdown. One convict dead, the other caught, and tonight the woman at the center of it all for the first time on why she did it. We begin with ABC's Gio Benitez.
Today, Joyce Tilling Mitchell, in stripes, shackles, and tears, pleading guilty to helping the two murderers escape.
She was swept off her feet a bit for a period, and then when she realized who she was dealing with, everything changed.
In newly released statements, Mitchell describes a deepening friendship with inmate Richard Matt. Quote, "He treated me with respect and was nice to me," she says. "He made me feel special. That relationship turning sexual. Inmate Matt grabbed me and kissed me." Mitchell also admits sending naked pictures to the other prisoner, David Sweat, telling police Matt told her, "We were all going to be together."
She got in over her head into something that she never should have started, but she did, and she's paying the price.
Mitchell admits smuggling hacksaw blades, chisels, a punch tool, and a screwdriver to the prisoners, hiding them inside frozen hamburger meat. Matt giving her 2 pills to drug her husband Lyle on the day of the escape. They referred to Lyle as the glitch. The plan? Joyce Mitchell would pick up the escapees and drive back home where they would kill her husband. But she gets cold feet, and when she doesn't show up, the men escape into the deep, rugged woods, launching the 3-week manhunt. Joyce Mitchell soon under arrest as we track down her husband.
What do you make of the reports that she was trying to have you killed?
Today, Lyle Mitchell visiting his wife in jail. And why did she do it? "I was caught up in the fantasy," she says. "I enjoyed the attention, the feeling both of them gave me, and the thought of a different life." Joyce Mitchell will be sentenced in September. She faces up to 7 years behind bars. David, her lawyer, says she knows she made a horrible mistake.
And her husband visiting her today.
That's right.
Gio, thank you.
So certainly from that video of the employee Joyce Mitchell at the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York, you may have recognized some of those unethical behaviors of her introducing contraband into the facility, of her developing relationships with some of the inmates, of overlooking violations, in the sense that the inmates had came on to her and she did not bring those to the attention of the administration. So there were a handful of things that could arguably be considered unethical in that case. So next, I have another video about an incident that happened in New York. This was also at the Clinton Correctional Facility. That's just a coincidence. I'm not sure that this particular facility is known for any type of unethical behavior. It just happened to be the stories that I came up with. So I do want to warn you that this video contains some graphic imagery, and so just to be forewarned with that in this video.
He was leaning back into us because he was being non-compliant.
Inmate Strickland, you're going to comply with a strict arrest. Do you understand me? Yeah. I hope you do. The cuffs will be taken off, one hand at a time, raised up on the wall. You understand that? Yeah. All right.
He was pushing off the wall. We had to hold our hands up on his back just to keep him there.
How would you classify the pushing off the wall? Gently?
There was a lot of pressure.
Violently?
Yes.
You gotta stop resisting us. Put your hand on the wall. Strickland, you gotta comply with the orders. Put your hand on the wall. Step to the wall. Put your hand on the wall. We have no compliance, sir. No compliance. Put back up. Put your hand back. Goes back on. No compliance. You're taking that back. You want to see? You want to see? Walk. Walk on your own. Walk on your own. Sergeant, you're using the walk.
Now entering Hospital 1 walkway.
Stand up. We got some guys up here, Charlie. He's resistant.
Listen to me.
Just stand
up.
You gonna stand? I'm going up by this.
Restricting all procedure. Walk. Now entering elevator, Hospital 1.
Yeah, well, we got...
Do you have any belief that inmate Strickland was in medical distress? No, sir. At any point in time, up to this 503 mark, did you check his pulse? No, sir. Did anybody in your presence check his pulse? No, sir. Did anybody check his breathing? No, sir.
Stand up. Let's go.
Come on. Downstairs, no, he won't let anybody go. We can't even get close to him. He said, oh, you score some.
Well, right here.
Okay. I know you had the art. Just get him on his back. Get him on his back.
What, if any, was the reason that the handcuffs remained on inmate Strickland?
At this point, medical's involved, but he's still a disciplinary problem. There's been no call made on what's going on with him, so I'm not going to get the handcuffs off.
Well, what risk was inmate Strickland posing for the disciplinary reason?
You don't know the risk.
I've got to intubate this fellow.
No, absolutely not. Is there any way we can get those cuffs off the back of him? Yes.
So, just strap her up here. Careful. 1, 2, 3. Up. Bring him up.
So as opposed to the last example that showed Joyce Mitchell and her behaviors, those seem to be fairly clear-cut as unethical, although there are plenty of situations such as this that might not be as clear-cut, in the sense that you had heard one of the officers stating that you never know what risk that an individual may pose, and so they are trying to judge the safety of the outcome against their choice to not remove handcuffs, for example. And so you can kind of see how these deontological and teleological ethical systems apply to various situations, and hopefully these two examples kind of give you an idea of how these things might translate to real incidences that have occurred. So we'll just conclude here with, how do we prevent unethical behavior in employees of the criminal justice system? So this little picture or comic on the right there states, we've got to draw the line on unethical behavior, but draw it in pencil. And one of the things that I think that's kind of cute is that it shows that perhaps people are unwilling to be clear-cut about the behaviors because they themselves may want to, they may also have ulterior motives, for example. But so how do we prevent unethical behaviors? Some of that may be to increase the pay that individuals who work in the criminal justice system earn, and later on in the semester we'll talk a little bit about how, for example, correction officers are paid fairly low compared to some similar occupations such as law enforcement, but by paying a professional wage that may reduce the temptation to engage in unethical behavior for monetary gain, for example. Developing a code of ethics. So as I had mentioned before, there were those 4 code of ethics for law enforcement, judges, attorneys, and correctional officers. But if we had code of ethics that that individuals from all ranks could partake in creating, then people may feel more invested in that code of ethics. Requiring training may be important, not only at the beginning of someone's career, but throughout an individual's career to really reinforce the types of behaviors that are considered ethical. Supervision is a really important one, as we had mentioned with the noble cause corruption, for example, that individuals who are not being supervised in their position may have more opportunities to engage in unethical behavior. Disciplining violators, that relates to the foundation or justification of punishment of deterrence, and so by having a harsh punishment, that would be a good deterrent, a general deterrent for other people to not engage in unethical behavior. And then promoting those who do behave ethically would be an example of rewarding the positive behavior so others see the benefit of engaging in ethical behavior. And to encourage whistleblowing, so that would be like individuals who come forward to shed light on issues and unethical behavior that is occurring within the workplace. This may be a little bit more difficult because oftentimes people who are whistleblowers have a lot of backlash from other employees. And so under that circumstance, it might be important to encourage confidential or anonymous reports of unethical behavior. And then finally, one of the other things that may be useful for preventing unethical behavior would be to encourage outside reviewer involvement. So if you have individuals outside of an organization reviewing behaviors, that could help to diffuse the subculture development within a particular organization. And of course, there's plenty of other ways that might help to prevent unethical behavior, but this is just a handful of examples. So I will post some more information about this online. There will be a little written homework about this that would be an activity in class, but since we haven't had class, I'll have you just do a little write-up to apply some of this information to real cases. So hopefully, if you have any questions, you've jotted those down, and I can answer those in the next class session. And this concludes the chapter on Ethics and Corrections, Chapter 4.